Abandoned by her own parents because of her appearance, Maria grew up alone, fighting the stigma and the pain of rejection. At 23, she became a renowned lawyer, a strong, intelligent, and unbeatable woman. But 20 years later, the parents, regretful, reappear asking forgiveness. However, when Mary discovers the true reason why she was left behind, she finds herself faced with a difficult choice. Maria was a child who was born carrying the stigma of her appearance. Unlike other girls, she had physical characteristics that, in the eyes of many, were considered disproportionate. His face was marked by an asymmetry that scared, his eyes were of an unusual size, and his skin, pale and with blemishes, did not seem to fit into the beauty standards that dominated society. The first thing Maria's parents noticed when seeing her was disappointment. They, like many people, believed that a child's appearance was a reflection of the success of his creation. They expected a beautiful daughter, as every mother and father expect, but the reality was too hard for them. Abandoned at the age of 3 in an orphanage, Maria had never known the real reason. Your parents simply disappeared from your life without leaving an explanation. At first she did not understand, but over the years it was clear. Her parents had decided that she was not worthy of her love, as if her appearance were a curse that would drive people away from her life. Time has passed, but the pain of rejection never left Mary. However, she had a force within her that kept her alive and determined to move on. Her natural intelligence and her ability to quickly learn her to overcome the sadness of her childhood, even if it was hard for her to deal with abandonment. When she was only 12, Maria started studying alone, and over time stood out in her studies, especially in the area of law. Not only did she want to prove she was capable of, but she also wanted, with all her soul, to reach something her parents could never imagine for her. At 23, Maria graduated in law, and with her sharp intelligence, soon became a renowned lawyer. Her reputation grew rapidly, and she became known for her merciless style in legal battles, strategic ability, and above all, the way she could turn any situation into a victory. But she still carried with her the mark of abandonment. The memory of her parents' disappointed look always haunted her, and the thought that society also considered her ugly to constantly pursue her. It was then, 20 years after being left behind, that his now older and apparently sorry parents reappeared in his life. They were desperate, apologizing, claiming that they had made a mistake and wanted to reconcile with their daughter they had abandoned. They explained that although they knew how talented she was, they now wanted to be by their side, trying to repair the damage they caused in the past. But what really brought them to Maria? Would it be the pain of regret, or was there anything else? Maria felt a strange feeling to see them. Something inside her could not simply accept the excuses that seemed false, as if the parents had a hidden plan. After all, the abandonment she suffered was more than a simple emotional choice. It was a cruel, without apparent reason, that left her with a deep void. Maria's office was a true fortress, the walls adorned with diplomas and awards that reflected their meteoric rise in the legal world. She has always been a woman of few friends, preferring the loneliness of her work and the company of her own thoughts. However, despite his brilliant career, a void persisted in his heart. She surrounded herself with success, but something inside her still shouted for answers. Who were your parents? Why had they abandoned her without even an explanation? Maria had never known for sure why she was left in the orphanage. His memory of childhood was diffuse, composed of flashes of cold and long days without any demonstration of affection. The name Maria was given to her by the orphanage officials, and she didn't even know the surname of biological parents. His childhood was marked by painful loneliness, but also by an unshakable force. She swore from an early age that nothing and no one could determine her destiny. However, the arrival of her parents, two aged faces she barely recognized, brought out a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. They found her on a gray morning after a meeting with one of her most powerful customers. Maria was sitting behind her table, looking at the papers of an important case when the secretary called her. Mrs. Maria has a visit. They say they are their parents. The sound of these words caused such a strong impact that Maria could hardly breathe. She looked at both of them, a man and a woman, who seemed to be on the brink of anguish. They had a regretful but also nervous air. It was as if they were on a mission they didn't know exactly how to perform. Maria, the woman said, the trembling voice, we are your parents. We came looking for you after all this time. We know we don't have the right to apologize, but we want a chance to do the right things." She looked at them without saying a word, the silence weighing like a sharp knife. The woman's face seemed familiar, but distant as a forgotten memory. The man beside him, his eyes low, seemed unable to look straight at her. Maria felt the weight of 1,000,000 emotions invading her body, but kept her posture. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice cold, but without hiding the pain her words carried. The parents sat hesitant. They started talking, explaining that they had made a terrible mistake in the past, who felt guilty of abandonment and somehow wanted to redeem themselves. Maria listened, but something inside her rebelled against that explanation. It didn't seem real. It didn't seem enough. They said they had never wanted to hurt her, but the story that told it sounded empty. There was something she couldn't understand, a detail that seemed to be omitted. The mother's gaze, full of regret, did not touch her as she expected. Something was wrong. That visit brought more questions than answers, and Maria knew something wasn't right. Parents wanted to approach her, but what had really motivated them to look for their lost daughter after so long? She couldn't trust them, not after all that had gone, but she was willing to understand what was happening and find out the truth, until the end. The days after the reunion were a whirlwind to Maria. She tried to focus on work, but her mind was far away, absorbed by the words unfit, by the emptiness her parents had left in her life. They asked for a new chance, but Maria knew it would be impossible to erase the years of pain and abandonment. The excuses were empty, and something inside her said that there was something deeper behind it all. In the following days, Maria began to investigate. She was a strategic woman, always attentive to the details. Something in his parents did not seem to fit in, and curiosity, coupled with his need for justice, propelled her. She used all her resources and contacts in the legal world, discreetly asking for information about her parents' past. The answers were hard to find, but Maria didn't give up. She wanted to understand why, 20 years later, they had reappeared so suddenly in her life. One afternoon, Mary received a mysterious letter. There was no sender, just an address and a date. She felt a shiver when opening the envelope, where she found a single sheet of paper with a short but impactful message. "The truth is in a place you never imagined. Look where the secrets are buried." The message seemed riddles, but Mary, with her sharp mind, knew she was closer to the answer than ever. She followed the track and, after weeks of secret investigation, discovered a file buried in an old legal record deposit. It was a cool document with details about its adoption and, most importantly, a series of notes and medical reports. When Mary read the pages, the truth finally turned out. Her parents had not abandoned her just because of her appearance. There was an even more cruel reason for their act. His birth, according to medical reports, had been a major event for his parents. Not because of her birth, but because she had been a child with a rare condition that, according to doctors of the time, could have serious implications for the future. The diagnosis was given at the time of birth. Maria would be a person with cognitive disabilities, someone unable to live a normal life without constant special care. The medical recommendation was for her to be placed in a specialized institute. However, their parents did not accept this condition. They were informed that there was a minimal chance that Mary had an ordinary life, but the truth was that for them that was not enough. They didn't want a defective daughter. It was easier to simply leave behind than to face a reality that embarrassed them. They preferred to follow their lives, abandoning Maria without hesitation, believing that she would never have the future she deserved. This explained their silence for the next 20 years. They never tried to look for her, for them the decision was made and nothing could change her vision. Now, after years, the parents were back, not because they genuinely regretted their choice, but because, after the death of a rich family member, they had inherited a fortune and wanted to recognize their daughter who, in their mind, would never be more than a forgotten memory. The reason why they had moved away from Mary was not only pride or shame, but the idea that she was undesirable. They saw in her a barrier to her own happiness, and so they discarded her as a useless object. Maria was in shock. She felt a wave of anger consume her body. What she had discovered was more than a simple lie. It was a deep trace of cruelty that explained the decision of his parents. Not only had they physically rejected her, but mentally and emotionally, as if she were less human. Now that the truth was revealed, Maria knew what she needed to do. She could no longer allow these parents to approach her. could not accept a non-genuine forgiveness. There was something within him that required justice. The pain of abandonment and the cruelty she had now knew propelled her for a clear goal: revenge. Maria didn't want to destroy her parents, but she needed them to feel the weight of what they did. She prepared to act intelligently, using the law but also her own emotions to give them the feeling of abandonment she had felt for so many years. They would pay for your choice, not with her forgiveness, but with the bitter understanding that, in the end, she would never forgive them. Maria began to plan her revenge in a meticulous way, using her legal experience and the coldness she had cultivated over the years. But her decision would not just be about exposing her parents' hypocrisy. She wanted something deeper, more impactful. For her, true justice did not come from a simple process, but something that touched the soul of who caused such pain. During this time, she began to approach one of the few friends she had, Lucas, a college colleague who was always present, but had never known the details of her childhood. He, even with his agitated life, perceived Maria's emotional distance, but never pressured her to talk about her past. However, with the weight of the discovery, Maria could no longer stay away from her own feelings. She told Lucas the truth, and he, though shocked, offered unconditional support. Maria knew that he would never completely understand the pain she felt, but somehow he had become an anchor for her over the last few years. He was willing to help her as needed, but always with a close look, suspicious that Maria was on a journey of revenge that could become destructive. Meanwhile, Maria's story was still shaped by her past. When your parents returned to your life, it was not just because of the inheritance. They were actually trying to infiltrate the social networks and circles of influence of Mary. They wanted to be seen, to have a daughter back so they could pose for photos, pose like the perfect family before others. They did not see the value of Mary as a human being, but as a piece to be repositioned in the scenario they wanted. They wanted to transform what was a mistake of the past into a story of overcoming, without really understanding the depth of the pain they caused. Gradually, Mary began to act. Using social networks strategically, he began to make small public plays that put their parents in uncomfortable situations. She knew the truth was on her side, but wanted to make sure that in the end, no one else believed in the lame excuses of her parents. She gradually revealed some details of the story indirectly, without slapping the face directly. Lucas began to worry about what Maria was doing, especially when she began to schedule meetings with the media. He feared she was starting to get lost in her own revenge, but Maria had a clearer view of what she wanted. She knew that to destroy their image, she needed to expose hypocrisy publicly, as far as possible. The situation took an unexpected course when their parents, realizing that they could no longer control the narrative, tried to negotiate directly with it, offering a great sum of money in exchange for their complicity, with the promise that they would repair their mistake. Mary looked at the offer with a cold smile, knowing that by accepting her she would lose something essential: her dignity. She didn't want money. She wanted something much deeper and more painful: understanding of what her parents had made, and the payment for it. After all, the money would not erase the wounds of an abandoned child. The offer was rejected. Instead, Maria began to articulate a public movement, making a point of using her position as a renowned lawyer to turn the case into something that won national repercussions. The news began to spread, and soon Maria's story was in newspapers and social networks. She had not just turned the game against her parents, she was exposing them to the public trial of all who, like her, felt that the value system was corrupted by appearance, status, and pride. And as the media warmed, Mary saw her name becomes synonymous with resistance and overcoming. She was no longer just seeking justice, but she was becoming a symbol of someone who would not be destroyed, no matter what was needed. His parents' excuses became even more empty as public judgment slowly destroyed them. The conflict reached a point where Mary's pain and anger turned into something even more dangerous. When their parents realized that they were losing control of the situation, they tried a last card, a desperate attempt to reconnect with it, a maneuver that seemed to be a gesture of genuine repentance. They asked for a private meeting without the cameras, without the media judgment, and offered a last chance for her to forgive what they had done. Maria accepted the meeting, but was prepared. She knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, could erase what they did. What she wanted was not forgiveness, but a revenge as exact as the suffering she had borne all these years. When they meet in a small conference room in a commercial building, their parents were more vulnerable than ever. The woman, now with gray hair and tired countenance, no longer looked like the distant and insensitive person from years ago. She looked small, almost fragile, compared to the strong and determined woman that Maria had become. The man beside her had his eyes low, as if he felt the weight of the guilt that finally consumed him. Mary watched them for a moment, without saying a word. She was waiting for the right moment, studying every reaction, every gesture. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but full of a silent force. "Do you want me to forgive what they did?" She looked straight into their eyes. "I can't. I don't even want to." Maria's mother tried to say something, but she raised her hand, asking for silence. She knew what her parents wanted, but what she wanted was not reconciliation. She wanted them to know the weight of what they caused. And it was at that moment that Mary revealed the truth that none of them knew. Everything they did, all the abandonment, had not been in vain. She had created an empire, something that now even they could not destroy anymore. "The truth you don't know," Maria started with a cold smile, "is that you are not here for regret. They are here because they have lost control. They are here because for the first time, they realize that I am stronger than any of you imagined." The man tried to protest, but Maria interrupted again, now revealing the legal record she had found, the evidence that detailed what her parents really thought about her. There was no way to deny the truth. There was no way to erase what they had done. Maria had not only found the information, she would use it to destroy her parents' reputation. She had a series of documents that proved that Maria's abandonment was not a decision for lack of financial conditions, but for pure cruelty, motivated by shame and prejudiced idea that she was not good enough. "I'm so much more than you could ever dream, and I'm ready to show it to the world." With this revelation, the weight of Mary's words began to break the resistance of her parents. What seemed to be a reconciliation meeting became a public exhibition of his suffering. They had no idea what their daughter had become, a woman of power, control, and sharp intelligence. They were being unmasked before her. Maria knew that revenge would not only be in the personal field, but also in the public arena, where their lies would finally be exposed. She had become more than a simple victim of her actions. It was a force, a symbol of resistance. At the end of the meeting, her parents were devastated, unable to understand the depth of the woman she had become. They left the room without words, no further excuses. Maria, on the other hand, was no longer angry. She felt something much deeper, a sense of justice that was finally yours. The weeks following the meeting were intense, and Maria was preparing for the impact of what she had just started. The news of his revenge and public exposure of his parents spread quickly. The audience was divided. Many supported her, seeing her a woman who had finally broke free from a painful past, while others criticized her, saying that she was letting herself consumed by bitterness and pain. But Maria didn't care. She knew what she was doing. She wanted her parents to feel what she felt when being ignored, neglected, and rejected. The media kept talking about the case. Reports and articles were written, interviews were conducted, and the social networks were in poverty. Mary's name became synonymous with courage, but also of revenge. She used this to her advantage, consolidating her position in the legal market, her image now stronger than ever. But inside, she felt a storm of emotions she couldn't control. She didn't feel relieved. It was not at peace. The real weight of the consequences came when she received a formal letter. It was a threat from his parents, now with powerful lawyers by his side. They had filed a lawsuit against her, alleging defamation and seeking financial compensation for the way they had been exposed. The most ironic of all was that, as much as they were injured by public revelation, they never apologized or expressed any kind of genuine repentance by the way they treated it. Maria knew that this was just another attempt to control her life, but she was not willing to give in. She knew this cool battle wouldn't be easy, but there was something that moved her: the truth. With the support of Luke and other allies who believed in his cause, Maria faced her parents in court. The room was tense, everyone's eyes turned to her while the cool battle unfolded. She used all the weapons she had, not just to defend her name, but to expose her parents' hypocrisy and cruelty so that no one could ignore. She knew this was the last step of her revenge. During the process, Mary's parents tried one last time to apologize publicly, trying to win the public and the judge's sympathy. They claimed they were sorry, and that their initial attitude had been moved by fear and ignorance. But Mary's words were relentless. She brought up the documents, the evidence, the medical reports, all she had discovered, and that proved the true reason she had been rejected. Not only did she win the process, she destroyed the narrative her parents had tried to build on her life. They could no longer be seen as victims or regretful figures. They were the villains of history, and Mary had revealed this to the world. His revenge was complete. At the end of the trial, Maria felt as if she had climbed a mountain and finally reached the top. She didn't feel relief, but she felt a sense of conclusion. She didn't need anything else her parents could offer. She had been free from the weight of abandonment, shame, and pain she carried for years. Now she was more than ever owner of her own destiny. After the trial, Maria came to see her life from a new perspective. The legal victory was undoubtedly significant, but the real impact was much deeper. Throughout the revenge process, she had fed on anger and resentment, believing that these emotions would support her. However, as the case came to an end, Maria began to realize that despite everything, she still carried a weight that could not simply be erased with a judicial victory. She walked away from the focus of her career for a while, leaving aside professional commitments and dedicating herself more to her own reflection. She wanted to understand who she was now, without the shadow of her parents, without the anger that propelled her. What did she really want for herself? What would be the woman who had been shaped by pain and abandonment? Over time, she began to open to new possibilities. Maria has always been an action woman, focused on work, but now she allowed themselves moments of reflection, self-knowledge. He spent hours alone, reading, walking around the city, or just watching the world in a different way. The pain, which was for so long its strength, began to turn into something lighter, like a distant memory that instead of consuming it, helped it grow. Lucas, who was always by his side, noticed the changes. He saw her start smiling more, allowing himself to experiment with new friendships and even finding moments of pleasure in simple things. She was no longer stuck in the past, the revenge she had consumed so much of her energy. She was beginning to rediscover a life out of her parents' shadows. One of the greatest steps Maria took was toward forgiveness, but not toward her parents. The forgiveness was for herself. She learned that the pain she carried did not need to define her future. She would no longer be the woman who was defined by a dark past. She understood that, to move on, she finally needed to release the shackles of resentment. Maria returned to her work with a new vision. She used her experience to help those who, like her, were marginalized or abandoned. His cases began to reflect not only their intelligence and legal skills, but also a new empathy and understanding of life. She wanted to be the voice of those who couldn't fight alone, those who, like her, had been forgotten by the system. The woman she had become was no longer the victim of her parents. She was someone who had rebuilt from the ashes of pain. Her career was more solid than ever, but now she felt complete in a different way. Maria no longer needed her parents' validation. She didn't need anyone else to feel whole. At the end of her revenge journey, Maria found something more powerful than any recognition or reparation. She found herself, the woman who was born with the weight of being rejected, the woman who used revenge as fuel, was now free, not only from the past, but also from the invisible currents that connected her. She was the owner of her story. Maria's life continued with new challenges and new opportunities. His name, now immortalized in the media for his courage and intelligence, has become a symbol of strength but also of transformation. People saw her not only as a brilliant lawyer, but as someone who, despite everything, had known to rebuild and reinvent herself. She was more focused than ever in her career and helping those who, like her, were victims of abandonment and contempt. However, the past did not leave her so easily. When he least expected, Maria received a letter from her parents, no longer apologizing but demanding her part in the inheritance that had been left to her after the death of a distant relative. They claimed that they had rights about fortune, arguing that even with the troubled past, they were their biological parents and that she was morally forced to forgive them and share what had been left to them. The letter was not just a money request, but an attempt to get control over your life, to manipulate the narrative again. Maria knew that this action was just a continuity of their behavior, trying to take advantage of their position. But something inside her revolted, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the desire to directly confront her parents, not with revenge, but with a last lesson. She knew that time had passed and that she would no longer be the same fragile and lost person who had been left behind years earlier. She had a choice. let anger and hatred return to dominate her, or use the opportunity to show her parents that, regardless of what happened, she had overcome it all. Mary prepared for the final confrontation with them, not angry, but with a deep desire that they finally understood the consequences of their actions. She didn't want to destroy them anymore. I just wanted to show them what they had lost, the opportunity to be part of their lives, to see the woman she had become. For her, this would be the most painful, more impactful revenge. Lucas, worried, tried to deter her. He knew how much the situation could affect her emotionally and was afraid that Maria lost her back in the shadows of the past. But she was determined. She knew this final confrontation was necessary, so she could finally close the cycle and move on. Her parents needed to understand that they could no longer play with her fate. She prepared for the last great test of her emotional journey. The climax would not be just a matter of justice, but of self-supply. She would face her parents for the last time, not like the abandoned girl, but as the strong and independent woman who had full control of her own life. The day of the final confrontation arrived, and Maria felt a mixture of emotions. She knew that this moment would be crucial not only to her parents but also to herself. They had wanted her again, now seeking not only money, but trying to manipulate her emotions to give in to her will. They were so used to controlling everything, shaping others to their image, which probably did not imagine Mary's power. The meeting was scheduled for a hot summer afternoon in an elegant conference hall in a modern building. When Mary entered, her parents were there, sitting, as always, with an expression of supposed dignity. But Mary saw them differently now. It was no longer the parents that she had idolized in her childhood, but small and pathetic figures whose mistakes now seemed so large that they could no longer be hidden. The man, with his gray hair and stealthy eyes, and the older and tired woman were trying to disguise the tension in their faces. When Mary entered, there was a silence. She was an imposing presence, not just for her posture, but for the trust that emanated from every step she took. She looked at both of them, without a word, just absorbing the moment. Maria sat at the table, and her parents' lawyer started talking, trying to negotiate as if it were just another legal transaction. They talked about the right they thought they had, the inheritance, about how Mary, despite their anger, should give in. But Maria was no longer willing to play according to their rules. She looked straight at her parents and said calmly, but a firmness they had never witnessed, "I'm not the girl you have left. I am no longer the child you have tried to destroy. What they offered me, what they thought they could get from me, no longer has power. I own my own life." The parents tried to speak, but she interrupted them. What she would say at that moment was no longer about revenge, but about truth. She wanted them to see the woman who had become and the pain they had caused. "The inheritance is not about money for me. It is about what you could never understand, about the fact that you had the chance to love me, to support me, to see me grow, and chose to leave me. Not because I was a burden, but because I didn't meet your expectations. I was not what you wanted." Mary felt the weight of each word, every lost look they cast toward her. They were starting to understand, but too late. They had destroyed any chance to redeem themselves. "But now," she continued with a determined look, "what I want you to know is that I'm not here to do justice in the name of anyone but myself. I don't need you. I don't need your forgiveness. I have forgiven myself, and that's what matters." The silence fell over the room. His parents were now speechless. The weight of the truth that Mary had thrown upon them was immeasurable. What had been a confrontation for money became a moment of painful understanding for them. They finally understood that they could no longer manipulate their daughter, which she had overcome them. They had lost everything: the opportunity to be a part of their life, the chance to see who she had become. Maria got up and, before leaving, looked at them one last time, without grudge, but with the certainty that her cycle was closed. Were they devastated? But was their destruction she wanted? No, it was the recognition that she no longer needed them. She had found her own way. Upon leaving the room, Maria felt a freedom she had never imagined. Revenge was no longer in seeing them suffering, but in the way she had managed to rebuild her life without depending on anyone. She now had the strength of turning from a victim into a winner. Maria walked down the street, the steps firm and decided, like never before. The weight of everything that happened in recent years has finally began to disappear. She knew that the meeting with her parents had been the last chapter of a long history of pain and revenge, and at the same time, the beginning of something new. something that was completely under your control. As the sun was beginning to put, Maria stopped in front of her house mirror and looked at. She saw a strong woman there, able to overcome any obstacle. The scars of the past, now healed, were no longer marks of pain but overcoming. She didn't need anyone's validation, her parents, society. No one else had the power to define who she was. She had already forgiven herself, had already broke free. Mary felt an inner peace she had never imagined to achieve. He knew he would still have challenges ahead, but now he was ready to face them with a renewed force. She had learned to love herself in a way that no one else could offer. The revenge she had sought, though necessary, was no longer her engine. Now she walked toward a future she drew herself. The last lesson she learned was the most valuable. True freedom was not to destroy others, but to break free from everything that held her to the past. She had overcome pain, rejection, and abandonment, and that made her invincible. She looked at the horizon, with a quiet smile on her face. What happened from that moment was just another page in her history, a story she would write herself without the shadows of a painful past. Maria now was the owner of her destination. 20 years later, Maria was at the height of her career. A respected woman in the field of law, she had become an unbeatable defender of women and children's rights, and her history of overcoming was told as an example of strength and resilience. She was still remembered by her parents, but not angry, but with a distant echo, like a distant memory she had left behind. In an important event, Maria was invited to a speech on justice and reconstruction. As she took the stage, she looked at the audience, feeling deep gratitude for her journey. She knew that her painful past as she was would not define her future. She had gained her freedom and, most importantly, her peace. As she always said, the greatest forgiveness is not for others but to yourself. It's the only way to be truly free. And so Mary moved on, without looking back, with the certainty that nothing in the world could anymore to get her out of her way. Mary's story is an example of courage, overcoming, and the pursuit of true freedom. She teaches us that the greatest power is not in revenge, but in the ability to forgive yourself and move on. Now it's your turn to write your own journey. Don't let the past define who you are. Free yourself, conquer what is yours, and never lose the strength of believing in your own potential. If you were moved by Mary's story, share with those who need to hear this message of hope and transformation. The true change begins within us.